Okay, well, we're at 3:03, so I'm going to get started and hopefully more people will join us. But again, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining today's public budget meeting this afternoon. For those of you I haven't met, I'm Janine Benner and I'm the director of the Oregon Department of Energy. I'm here with a number of ODOE staff and I will ask them to introduce themselves in the chat when they get a chance. I'll be doing most of the talking, but we're all here to answer questions if you have them. So as a reminder, we are here to walk through the Oregon Department of Energy's 2027 to 2029 agency request budget, which is our formal budget request for the upcoming biennium. My goal today is to give you a clear understanding of what's in our request, how it supports our mission, and what it means for Oregonians and ESA paying utilities. So here's a quick overview of how to participate on Teams. Because this is a big meeting, we've put everyone on mute and we have cameras off, but we would love to answer your questions. So please use the raise hand button for questions or type questions into the chat at any time. My colleague Christy will be monitoring both hands raised and questions in the chat, and she will interrupt me as necessary. We will also pause periodically to answer questions from both the chat and the raised hands, and we'll also try to leave time for questions at the end. All right. The materials that we will present today are also on our website, and my colleague Jenny is going to drop a link into the chat where you can find them by going to the About Us tab in the top menu bar on our website and clicking on Budget. These materials demonstrate how we arrive at our agency request budget, what the money is used for, how our programs and activities are funded, and what the projections are for the energy supplier assessment if the legislature chooses to adopt this budget. So this slide shows our roadmap for today. We'll start with an overview of the state budget process. This will probably be a reminder for some of you, but it's a complex process, and I always learn something new every time we go through it. We'll then go to key takeaways for this biennium. We'll get into more depth on these as we go through the presentation, but we wanted to get to the key points up front just in case you have to jump off early. We'll then cover high-level agency numbers and funding sources. Next, we'll do a deep dive into division and program area budgets. We'll walk through our budget program by program and highlight what we do in each program and how we fund our activities. Then we'll look at the policy option packages. We have 2 budget neutral POPs this biennium. We'll be talking about the energy supplier assessment throughout, but at the end, we'll show you how the ESA compares to previous biennia. For those of you unfamiliar with the energy supplier assessment, it's a fee charged to fuel providers and utilities that produce energy in Oregon, and it helps fund our work. Finally, we'll talk about required reduction options. This is something that all agencies are required to submit with our agency request budgets, and the reductions are for all fund types. We're still working on the details, but we're giving you a high-level summary of what we're thinking about. And then finally, we will cover next steps. As a reminder, the agency is required to hold this meeting by ORS 469-421, Section 8, which states that, quote, prior to filing an agency request budget, the director shall convene a public meeting with representatives of energy resource suppliers and other interested parties for the purposes of providing energy resource suppliers with the full accounting of the projected revenue needed to fund each department program or activity and the projected allocation of monies derived from the assessment to each department program or activity. All right. Do we have any questions yet, Christy? Okay.
Do not.
Thank you. So this slide has ODOE's vision and mission. We help Oregonians make informed decisions and maintain a resilient and affordable energy system. We advance solutions to shape an equitable, clean energy transition, protect the environment and public health, and responsibly balance energy needs and impacts for current and future generations. We do this by providing data, analysis, education, oversight, and financial incentive programs. Everything in our budget that we're going to talk about today is tied back to these responsibilities and statutory directives. The state budget process involves 4 stages. We start with the current service level, which takes our budget from last biennium and adjusts for inflation and other technical changes. CSL represents the amount needed to administer legislatively approved programs into the next biennium. Today's focus is on our agency request budget, or ARB, which is basically current service level plus proposed policy option packages. The ARB is submitted to the Department of Administrative Services and the Governor's Office, and then the Governor develops a Governor's recommended budget, which she submits to the legislature. Through this process, the Governor may revise ODOE's budget request. Finally, the legislature considers and votes on our legislatively adopted budget. Other legislation that's passed throughout the session can also affect our budget, so it's not actually final until it becomes our legislatively approved budget at the end of the legislative session, and that's what we actually work with. So again, today we're talking about the agency request budget, which is really near the beginning of that larger cycle. Here's another visual showing how this process works. You'll see on the left that we start with the 25-27 legislatively approved budget, and we make adjustments to get to our base budget. These adjustments are made enterprise-wide. From the base budget, we make additional adjustments like inflation, phasing in and out positions and programs, and we make other technical changes to shape our current service level budget. Again, most of these changes are calculated and determined by the Department of Administrative Services and the legislature. And I want to highlight the phase in, phase out step, where we need to remove programs or resources that were only provided funding for the current biennium, even if the program is anticipated to continue into the next biennium. So we had to do this with most of our incentive programs and then put the continuing ones back in through policy option packages. It's a little bit confusing. Once we add those policy option packages to our current service level, we reach the agency request budget. And we are currently at the We Are Here stage, which is presenting our budget request to you all before submitting it to DAS at the end of July. I will pause to see if there's any questions on the process.
We don't have anybody yet in the chat, but let's see if anyone wants to raise their hand and ask any questions. It'll be more exciting if people have questions.
All right, well, we'll keep going, but happy to take questions whenever. One more budget process slide before we get to the ODOE numbers. Just wanted to share a few terms that you'll hear throughout this presentation. Personal services are employee salaries and payroll costs, such as retirement and insurance. Services and supplies, or S&S, are contracted services, IT, travel, equipment, and other business operations expenditures. Under this category, professional services is how we fund contracts and consultants. Special payments are grants, incentives, and transfers where ODOE does not receive goods or services in return. And then debt service is all related to the Small Scale Energy Loan Program, or SELP. It's an old program at ODOE. We still have payments coming in from projects that got loans in the past, and then we use that money to pay debt service on SELP bonds. The SELP program is no longer actively making loans, so we're just servicing the existing portfolio. So I hope that understanding these categories will help make sense of some of the upcoming charts and graphs. Okay, key takeaways. This is going to be a long presentation, so we wanted to highlight some of the key takeaways up front. On this slide are some of the factors shaping the full budget request this biennium, and please keep these in mind as we go through the rest of the presentation. First, this is still early in the process. Our final budget won't be complete until mid-2027 when the legislature adjourns and we have our legislatively approved budget. As a reminder, the current service level covers our statutory work and phases out one-time programs that are ending. Examples include state-funded heat pump programs and some funding for reports that are complete. We are proposing 2 budget-neutral policy option packages, which we'll talk about later in the presentation. Like all agencies, our costs are rising due to inflation and increasing statewide charges. These are costs that we have no control over and that we need to absorb in our budget. For the energy supplier assessment, we're estimating that we will need about $19 million for the next biennium, which is about a 1% increase over last biennium. We were able to use some savings over the course of this biennium and last biennium to limit the growth in the ESA. But I want to caveat that this is our estimate at the agency request budget, governor's budget, legislative budget can make changes that impact this number. Okay, we're going to talk about all of these things more in a little bit, so perhaps you'll have some questions as we go into detail. So we're going to walk through the work of the department and give you a full accounting of the resources that we're requesting for this upcoming biennium. This slide shows how the agency request budget is distributed across program areas. On the left is ODOE's total budget. It includes the incentives and the SELP program. You can see that Energy Development Services is the largest portion due to federal funding and incentive programs. Most of that money is distributed as grants and rebates. On the right is the operating budget, and that includes personal services such as salaries for staff and services and supplies. These are the costs to administer ODOE's programs and day-to-day operations. I think we have a question. Government service charge cover for ODOE. These are all of the sort of joint services that the Department of Administrative Services provides to ODOE. There's some, maybe I'll ask Melody, our budget services manager, if she wants to come off and share what those charges are, or we can put it in the chat. Sorry to put you on the spot, Melody. Wanted to introduce you to everyone. Melody is our new budget services manager, and she's awesome, and we're so happy to have her.
Yes, state government service charges include all service charges that are passed down from Department of Administrative Services to all agencies. So they do include things like the EIS program, all of the technology, those things that come from DAS that they manage and monitor for agencies to use. They include CFO and all kinds of other, there's a whole list of charges that are included in this. All the way down to security for the, Capitol Mall is included as well in these things. So there's quite a bit included. Hopefully that gives you a good idea of what we include in there.
Thank you, Melody. And we can, DOJ, Jennifer, is, actually, let me go back. It's included in a different line item. Attorney General fees are separate from state government service charges, but we do pay for those.
Yep. So it's more like the government service charge is more like what DAS covers for each agency specifically.
Right. Good question. Thank you. So this chart shows a 10-year history of ODOE's budget. Our budget has fluctuated over time in response to federal funding, one-time legislative initiatives, and new program responsibilities. So I'm going to orient you to what you're seeing here on the slide. The dark blue at the bottom represents other funds. Other funds are fee-for-services, non-federal grants, and general funds from previous biennia that have been converted to other fund. So the CREP program is an example of that. Going up from there, the orange represents the energy supplier assessment, which is technically also other funds, but which we break out here to show you all. The light greenish yellow in the middle is federal funds, and you can see that this has grown significantly over the past years and is really the biggest part of our budget in the agency request budget. I do want to note that this bar includes funding that has been obligated to ODOE, but which may not show up. So for example, it includes Solar for All, which is an $89 million grant that the EPA canceled, but which we're challenging in court. The pink band is general fund. Since ODOE's incentive programs have not received additional funding from the legislature, this bar is much smaller than in the 21 through 25 years. It does include ongoing funding for some of our climate work and the building performance standards. And finally, the turquoise band at the top is other funds, debt services, non-limited. That's for the small scale energy loan program, which I mentioned earlier is no longer making new loans, but which still manages existing loans. The agency has to repay the bonds and service on the loans issued. And we do this with the money coming in from SELP projects repaying their loans. So this represents a sizable but really shrinking portion of our budget if you look back over time. Any questions on this slide?
Looks like Jennifer has her hand up.
All right, Stacy, can you unmute? Jennifer, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you. I was just wondering, I thought it was interesting you mentioned the Solar for All is included in the federal funds and that was under, is being litigated at the moment. So will the legislature actually appropriate those funds with the assumption or how does that work, I guess?
Yeah, it's a good question. We actually have someone from the Legislative Fiscal Office on the call, so he can put in the chat if I say this wrong, but this is part of our policy option package that basically provides us authority to spend the money if it comes in from the feds. So they would include it in our budget, but we'd only spend it if we got it. Does that make sense? No. Yes. Okay, great. Anything to add, Christy? You look like you wanted to say something.
No, sorry.
Okay.
Sorry for looking away. I think it's like an insurance policy so that if the money comes in, we are in shape to spend it.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, Ben says correct. Thank you, Ben. Okay. Any other questions on this slide? Okay. So where does the funding come from? Our funding comes from several sources. Each type of fund has a specific purpose or function that determines how it can be used. And we'll talk a bit more about each fund type on the next slide. But we get federal funds, fees and charges for services, the energy supplier assessment, general funds, and self-repayments. And as the slide says, we've really worked hard to diversify our budget in recent years. For example, we have gone after a lot of federal funding, and that's helping to reduce pressure on the energy supplier assessment. The ESA is assessed on utilities and fuel providers based on their gross operating revenues. All Oregonians pay the ESA when they pay for energy. And again, under the agency request budget, we project it will cost each Oregonian about $2.23 per year. So this chart shows the mix of funds supporting our current operations. It doesn't include SELP and incentives, which are just passed through the agency and aren't part of our operating budget. The ESA provides a stable base, while federal grants and service charges support specific program areas. Charges for services include the public purpose charge. We get some of that to support our schools' work. It includes money from the Bonneville Power Administration for the Northwest Power and Conservation Councils that we fund in our budget. And the council members that we fund in our budget. And then there's other fees for work we do with NEA and the Energy Northwest nuclear plant, for example. Federal revenue includes our ongoing grants for Hanford work and the state energy program from U.S. Department of Energy, but also one-time funding through the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. Before we move on to looking at our budget program by program, do you have any questions on the big picture? Okay, throw them in the chat if you do. Okay, so now we'll transition to the division budget. Oops. First, just a big picture look at ODOE and how we're organized. There's 5 major program divisions plus the director's office. I'll be spending some time going into detail on each program division in the next few slides. We also have staff several boards and commissions, such as the Energy Facility Siting Council and the Oregon Climate Action Commission. Planning and innovation is our biggest division at ODOE. The team provides information, analysis, and technical assistance on energy efficiency, clean energy technologies, and climate change. Their work ranges from building energy standards to renewable energy policy to climate action planning. They support schools, local governments, businesses, tribes, and farmers, helping reduce energy use and support clean energy transitions. The division is made up of 4 work streams: energy efficiency and conservation, technology and policy, and then 2 new sections that were added during the last biennium by HB 3409, codes and standards, and climate change. Those new sections are where most of the general fund is coming into the agency now. I want to acknowledge that there's a lot of detail on this slide, and I'm not going to go through it all, but you'll have it in the materials as reference. And we're going to have a slide like this for each of the program divisions. Planning and Innovation Division has had a busy biennium. You are probably familiar with the Oregon Energy Strategy, which was released last November after 2 years of modeling, engagement, and analysis. And over the next few years, this team will be really focused on implementing the energy strategy and also the associated executive order that was released shortly afterwards. During the last biennium, the new Codes and Standards section stood up the state's Building Performance Standards program, which will lower energy use and greenhouse gas emissions from the state's commercial buildings. The new climate change team produced the first ever natural and working lands-based net carbon inventory, a new greenhouse gas emissions forecast, and they're working towards creating a carbon sequestration goal for natural and working lands. They're also identifying natural climate solutions and developing metrics to track progress. And this was all assigned to us by legislation a few years ago. So again, we'll have a slide like this for each of the programs. I'm not going to cover everything here, but you can always come back to it later. Any questions about the work of planning and innovation? All right. There are 41 staff on the P&I team, about 31% of the agency. And you'll note down here at the bottom, Oregon's members of the Northwest Power and Conservation Council are funded by the Bonneville Power Administration, but they're funded through ODOE's budget, which is why they show up here. This slide shows the budget broken down by the programs and activities of the division on the left, and on the right side, it shows the revenue sources that support those activities. You can see that the largest slice of funding for this division, which traditionally came from the ESA, now comes from general funds. This is an example of how we've been able to diversify our funding streams. Other funds here mostly includes that BPA pass-through for the Power Council members, public purpose charge for schools, and large electric consumer public purpose charge program. Okay, here's a breakdown of the expenditures in planning and innovation, including spending categories. And I'm going to take a moment to walk you through the columns on this slide, because this is the same format that you're going to see for the rest of the program divisions as well. On the left, you can see the spending category. The main components are personal services, services and supplies, and special payments. So as you'll recall from the earlier slide, personal services are employee costs, S&S are operational expenditures, and special payments are transfers and payments where goods and services are not received in return, such as incentive payments. That big jump for special payments in the next biennium is mostly the federal dollars coming in for incentives to help with the building performance standard, to help building owners comply with that new standard. So the next column over is what the agency spent in these categories in 23-25. So those are actuals. Then comes what we have in the budget for the 25-27 legislatively approved budget, which is the biennium we're currently in the middle of. And to the right of that, you can see what we're budgeting for the 27-29 biennium in our agency request budget. In the middle is the percent of the funds in these activities that are covered by the ESA. So you can see that the ESA covers about 27.5% of planning and innovation's budget. Moving to the right, the 27-29 ESA column shows how much the ESA will cover of these costs in the next biennium. And then that final column shows the annual ESA. So it's basically just half of that previous column. Since we think about the ESA biennially, but we charge it annually. The next slide is going to break down these same numbers section by section for P&I, but I will just pause here first to see if there's any questions. What accounts for the large increase in general office and operations? Good question. I noticed that too. The thing to keep in mind is that the 23-25 column is actuals. So that's what we actually spent compared to what we budgeted for in the legislatively approved budget. And you can see in 23-25, we underspent in travel and training and office and operations as we were coming out of COVID. Also, the division grew by 20% in the 25-27 biennium, so more was budgeted in both those categories. Any other questions? All right, this slide shows ESA allocations across P&I's subprograms that draw on the ESA. So you can see that ESA funds 21% of energy efficiency and conservation activities, 58% of technology and policy, 25% of climate policy, and 3% of codes and standards. I just want to caveat something with this chart because, again, this is more granular than we get typically in our budget. These numbers are estimates, and there may be some shifting between categories. So there are some positions associated with the new programs that may show up on one line in this slide, but technically live on a different line in our actual budget. But the ESA percentage should all be accurate. So we're trying to just give you a sense of the amount that the ESA is covering in each program or activity. Pausing for questions. Okay. Moving on to the Energy Development Services Division, EDS. EDS,
we did just get a question.
Okay.
Breaking. Do you want to go back to the last slide?
Yes.
Thanks, Jennifer, for another question. With the growth in staff, is that BPS?
Yes. Building performance standard staff is a major part of the growth in P&I. And there were some positions added for the natural and working lands work within climate change. So EDS manages incentive and grant programs that reduce the cost of clean energy and energy efficient technologies for Oregonians. Programs include solar and storage rebates, heat pump incentives, community renewable energy grants, and grid resilience grants. EDS also manages the tail end of the small scale energy loan program that I mentioned earlier. I want to note that many of the programs on this slide are one-time funded with general fund or dependent on federal funding. So that means that some of them, such as the Oregon Solar and Storage Rebate, Oregon Rental Home Heat Pump, and Community Heat Pump Deployment Program, won't be providing new incentives into the next biennium if the legislature doesn't put additional funding in. But they're still on this list because even without additional funding, our staff still has work to do on the programs distributing that funding, existing funding. As I mentioned, some of the federal funding is uncertain. We talked about Solar for All. We're still waiting on U.S. Department of Energy for money for the Homes and Here program and the remainder of the Grid Resilience program. Also, for the one-time funded programs, we needed to phase them out in CSL and put them back in with the POP. We'll talk more about that later in the presentation. And I also want to note that our budget, our agency request budget, doesn't include any new general funds for these programs. And that's due to the state's budget situation and guidance that our budget needed to be budget neutral. Our POPs needed to be budget neutral. So ODOE was not able to propose adding any funds for these programs, even though they are popular. Interest in them traditionally outpaces available funding, and they're really important tools for meeting the goals of the energy strategy. So that's why they're not in our budget, but of course the governor or the legislature could decide to put additional funding in if revenue is unexpectedly available. Jennifer is asking if I'm so glad you're asking questions, Jennifer. Thank you. Are homes in here at risk? I am very optimistic about the $113 million for homes in here coming our way. The new administration, I guess it's not really that new anymore, but hadn't approved any state to launch a new program since January of 2025, but they just came out with some new guidance and sort of started to move again. So I am optimistic that we'll get permission to launch perhaps this year. So everything's always at risk, but I'm optimistic about Homes in Here funding. Any other questions on this slide? No, not to click on anything on my computer. Okay. So here are some EDS highlights. On this slide, you can see some of the great support our incentive programs have provided to Oregonians. We've supported nearly 7,000 solar and storage projects totaling 70 megawatts of solar capacity. We also have 100 projects that are still in progress. There are over 100 community renewable and resilience projects advancing all around Oregon. We've supported almost 10,000 heat pump installations around the state with our various programs. And we've supported 20 grid resilience projects from a program that I know has been helpful to many of the utilities on this call. Here's a little bit more on the grid resilience program. This is a federally funded program to strengthen the resilience of electric grids and reduce disruptive events. Through this program, ODOE has been able to support 20 utilities so far, which you can see on this slide, with funding for everything from undergrounding power lines to fire-resistant equipment to fire prevention systems. And I want to note that this federal program requires a state match that Oregon has decided to meet with general fund. Due to that budget neutral requirement for our POPs, we were not able to include all of the necessary match dollars from general fund in our request, but we're working with the governor's office and the legislature to figure out how to add it to our budget at the appropriate time. And that, again, is funding that the state will need to provide in order to access those federal dollars. Under the agency request budget, EDS would have a staff of about 27, all of whom are funded through general fund or federal fund. And I will note that this includes positions that support programs that we're adding back in via that POP. You can see in the pie on the left how this program is primarily going to be focused on running federally funded programs in the next biennium. On the right, you can see that state general fund plays a minimal role, but that maroon slice for the Community Renewable Investment Fund that supports the CREP program originated as general fund. So as I mentioned, this is an area of uncertainty in our budget in terms of federal funds and whether the legislature will decide to reinvest in any of the state funded programs. This slide shows that there is no ESA in EDS. Any questions on energy development services? Okay. Moving on to nuclear safety and energy security. This team protects the health and safety of Oregonians and our environment and advances and supports secure and resilient communities. They do this by leading Oregon's nuclear safety program, managing radioactive waste disposal and radioactive materials transportation programs. They represent Oregon's interests in the Hanford nuclear site cleanup and staff the Oregon Hanford Cleanup Board. This division also develops and implements Oregon's energy security plan, manages our state's emergency planning and response program for gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and propane. Over the last biennium, this division has continued to focus on energy security, preparing for nuclear emergencies associated with the impacts to Oregon of something happening at the Columbia Generating Station, or Hanford, in Washington State. They're also preparing for and responding to fuel emergencies, including helping to make sure that small airports have enough jet fuel to support wildfire fighting activities during the summer. This division continues to represent Oregon's interest in Hanford cleanup, which has had a particular focus in recent months on preparing for the safe transportation of Hanford waste through Oregon and trying to keep liquid Hanford waste from coming through the state. And then another area of increasing focus as we respond to public and legislative interest is on nuclear energy and the role it might play in Oregon's energy future. This is a small, specialized team of 6. Staff include nuclear emergency planners, technical specialists, and energy security experts. You can see here that this division is primarily federally funded, mostly from a grant from the U.S. Department of Energy that funds our work on Hanford. ESA contributes a small portion to ongoing emergency preparedness, nuclear energy policy, and waste oversight work. Here you can see the expenses and how much ESA contributes. Are there any questions on nuclear safety and energy security? Right, we're almost there. Energy facility siting. This division manages the state review of large energy facilities and supports the Energy Facilities Siting Council. Their major activities include reviewing applications and amendments, undertaking rulemakings and process improvements, and compliance monitoring. Over the last biennium, we've seen increased activity not only in the number and complexity of incoming projects, but also lots of interest in examining the process and how it can work faster and be more streamlined, while at the same time making space for public engagement and protecting Oregon's natural resources. It's a tough balancing job that this team does. Here's some highlights. Over the last 2 years, the Energy Facility Siting Council has approved over 16 megawatts of solar and almost 17 megawatts of battery storage projects. The team also worked on numerous rulemakings to make improvements to the existing process. And Siting is also working on a report assigned by Executive Order 25-29 to identify streamlining opportunities within the process. I see we have a request to go backwards to take a screenshot. I'm happy to do that, but you can see that our slides are also.
She's asking for slide 36, which hasn't come up yet. So I was just going to say, we'll get there in a few slides.
Oh,
or you can also access at the link. Either way.
Perfect. Okay, here is the siting team. It includes 15 staff across applications, compliance, federal coordination, and supporting the Energy Facility Siting Council, or FSEC. We have a policy option package, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, that would add a 4th compliance officer. And I will note that this team needs more capacity. We didn't ask for additional staff beyond that compliance officer in this budget request because we weren't able to make it budget neutral, but this is an area that we'll need to revisit in the future if the state continues to prioritize getting energy facilities and transmission projects built faster. Here's the budget overview. You can see that the majority of funding for our siting work comes from fees on developers. The fees are set on a cost recovery basis and are therefore unique to each project. The ESA does cover some of the costs of ODOE's siting work. This is by statute. The ESA covers work that can't specifically be charged to developers, but which supports the work of the division and the agency. This can include non-project specific costs like rulemaking and non-siting tasks like legislative testimony, budget preparation, and strategic planning. Any questions here? Here you can see how that breaks down over time and what it means for the energy supplier assessment. Pausing for questions on siting before we move on. And to take a drink of water.
You go ahead and take a sip and I'll let you know we do have another question. I'm just asking if the ESA percentage has gone up for FSEC and asking if it seems high to this person. To Jennifer. Hi, Jennifer.
Thank you. It has not gone up. It shows a little bit higher on this pie than in previous biennia because this year we have been able to segregate out the amount that each division is paying for the indirect rate. And I'm going to talk a little bit in a little bit when we get to administrative services about how the indirect rate works. But basically it's about 25 to 27% directly funded by the ESA, and then another slice on top of that to fund the administrative work of the agency, the overhead work. And that is why it looks higher this time. So hopefully that makes sense. I'm happy to go over that more, but maybe I should go through the administrative services budget and you can have a better sense of how the indirect rate works. So the Administrative Services Division supports all of the agencies, divisions, and functions. A lot of that work is really centralized in administrative services instead of spreading out through the programs. And so that's why the Administrative Services Division is relatively large at ODO. It includes two sections, the Director's Office and Central Services. The Director's Office employees provide resources and services agency-wide for audit, communications, public records requests, and strategic engagement with interested parties, citizens, and elected officials. And then the Central Services team handles payroll, contracts and procurement, grant management, budget, accounting, information technology, and other agency-wide activities. A lot of the work of the Central Services Division is in the background, executing contracts, making sure our folks get paid, developing budgets, and onboarding new employees. And that's really hard to highlight on a slide like this, but I did want to mention how critical it is to our agency. Other highlights include development of a new strategic plan, which you can find on our website, and which really redoubles our efforts to be as efficient and effective as possible and focus our work on Oregon's greatest energy-related challenges. I also want to highlight our Community Navigator, which was a new program last biennium. Our Community Navigator works hard to get out and about around the state and connect with communities, both to educate them about energy opportunities, but also to bring back information that helps make our work better and more responsive to the needs of Oregonians. Here's the Director's Office team, which includes an internal auditor, communications, and strategic engagement. And I'll note that we do fund one position in the Governor's Office through the Director's Office, which is supported by general fund dollars. Here's the Central Services team. You can see the different sections include human resources, IT, and finance and operations. And again, these staff support every program at ODO. Oops. Okay. These slides show the funding sources for administrative services. Administration is funded through our indirect rate. That's this big dark blue slice, which I'll talk about more in a minute. And that is in turn funded by each of our funding sources. And then administrative services is also supported directly by the ESA, federal, and general funds. So here's that same pie, but we're showing you how we fund the indirect rate with each of our funding sources. You can see that the ESA directly funds 18% of the administrative services budget, but then provides another 6% through the indirect rate. And the indirect rate is a way of distributing ODO's administrative costs throughout the whole agency and between each of our funding sources. And it's charged on each position. So the more federal funded positions we have, the more they contribute to indirect, and therefore the agency's administrative costs. So going back to siting, there's that slice that's directly funded by the indirect, but then each siting position pays a little bit towards ODO's administrative costs, and that's what brings it up to 33% overall ESA. Took me like 9 years of working at ODO to understand the indirect rate, so happy to try to answer any questions if people have them. Okay, everybody understands the indirect rate. Excellent. Here's the ESA breakdown for administrative services. You can see that it supports about 23% of the activities in this division. And then this is that same chart for each of the two sections within administrative services. Any questions before we move on to our policy option packages? Okay. In our agency request budget, we have proposed 2 budget neutral POPs. The first one is, we talked about a little bit earlier, it's the authority to roll over any remaining funds in our incentive programs. The agency will have ongoing work or unspent funds at the close of the current biennium in the programs that you see on this list. We don't necessarily know how much yet because it depends on how the outlay of these dollars goes this biennium. And this POP would basically give us the authority to spend those dollars into the next biennium. It's budget neutral because there's no additional funding. It just rolls forward existing funds, mostly federal, into the next biennium. The second POP is a new compliance officer in siting to manage workload. The division is currently relying on consultants, which cost more per hour for a lot of our compliance work. We did an assessment and determined that an additional staff person would allow us to perform those required tasks while saving money. The position will be paid for mostly by fees on developers, also by the energy supplier assessment. We've been able to make it budget neutral by figuring out how to reduce ESA spending within the siting division in other areas. So again, these are budget neutral. They don't increase the size of ODOE's budget. They reallocate existing resources. Any questions on our POPs? Okay, now we're going to go back to the ESA for a few slides. So you've already seen the details of how the ESA supports the programs and activities in our divisions. The next few slides are going to be a summary and then look at how the ESA in this agency request budget compares to previous biennia. As a reminder, the ESA is a statutory assessment on utilities and fuel providers and funds core statewide energy programs. It supports work that doesn't have other dedicated funding sources. The ESA is assessed on ratepayers' gross operating revenues. It's apportioned out to ratepayers based on their reported revenues as compared to revenues of other ratepayers. So ratepayers that see their revenues decline in proportion to other ratepayers could see their share of the ESA go down and vice versa. That means this 1% increase isn't necessarily what your utility will see on their ESA next biennium. The assessment is capped at 0.0375% of ratepayer revenues. And for 2025, ODOE assessed a rate of I put an extra zero in there, 0.375% of ratepayer revenues. And we assessed a rate of 0.1 in 2025, which is well below the statutory cap. Here's that summary of the agency's overall budget components and a projection for the ESA needed to fund each of these activities. This slide is for the entire agency, and we just saw that breakdown of each division and program. And on the right of the chart, you can see what percentage of each program and activity is covered by ESA. Pausing for questions. It's a lot of numbers. Okay, so here is, let's see. Okay, thank you, Jennifer, for appreciating our display of the ESA detail. We try. Okay, so the ESA has grown gradually over time as the cost of government has increased. For 2027-29, we're proposing an increase of about 1%. That is significantly below inflation, which is currently over 4%. And again, the caveat that this could change based on the legislatively approved budget. Any questions here? Okay, it looks like we'll have some time at the end for questions. But I do want to cover the required reduction options. So you're probably familiar from building your own budgets. Scenario planning is an important part of budget development with considerations of how to operate in different environments. So as part of the state budget process, agencies prepare a 5% and 10% cut list, which outlines how an agency plans to respond to a reduction in revenue. Agencies are required to develop this list for each fund type. On the top of this chart, you'll see the budget for each division under the agency request budget. And under the reduction targets, you'll see how much we'd be cutting under each scenario. We'll be submitting a more detailed cut list with our agency request budget. And once we do that, we can share it with those of you who are interested. So again, these numbers just show what the reductions would look like across divisions and fund types. And then, as I mentioned, we're still developing the reduction options, but here are the categories that we're looking at proposing reduction options: travel, office expenditures, and other services and supplies. We're going to avoid impacting existing staff positions if possible, and instead we would hold off on hiring vacant positions, for example. We strive to run efficiently and be good stewards of public funds, and as such, any reductions in our budget would have an impact on the delivery of programs, and those impacts and risks are listed on this slide. Reducing travel, for example, would limit our ability to engage with Oregonians around the state and engage with our peers in the region. Any questions or comments on these potential options? Okay, so here's our next steps. We will submit the agency request budget by July 31st. Then the governor's recommended budget will be released later this year, or possibly early next year if there's a change in governors. The legislature will review and refine the budget during the 2027 session, and then our final budget will be approved at the end of session. So I know we threw a lot of numbers at you just now. As you review these slides or reflect on the presentation, please let us know if there's anything missing in terms of information that you would like to know. There are many different ways to show these numbers, and the level of detail we get into for this presentation is more granular than what we actually submit in our budget to the legislature. But we really want to make sure you understand how the ESA is being spent. So please do reach out at any time if you have specific questions. And I will stop to see if there are any questions now.
It looks like we have a hand up from Brad, and then we can circle back to a comment from Jennifer.
Great.
Hey, Director Benner. Noted in the programs that have some money left over, you got the rental home heat pump program in there. Very popular, successful program. We would love to see more funds put into it. But noting there's a little bit left over, do you know when the agency is going to try and get those out?
Yes, rental home. I know we are looking at it right now, and actually I notice Pondian is on the call. Pondian, is there anything you can share about when we might be ready to go with those additional rental home heat pump dollars?
Thanks, Jenny. Hopefully late in the fall or early next year. The HP3 or the heat pump purchase program currently provides incentives for renters. So we are sequencing it out.
Probably important to note too that related to Jennifer's comment in the chat about staff for programs that don't have new funding, we don't have staff for programs that didn't get new funding. And that includes the rental home heat pump program and also the Oregon Solar and Storage Rebate Program. So we have to sort of like piece together staffing for those programs that have those rollover funds, which is partially why we have to sequence it. We opened the Oregon Solar and Storage Rebate Program about a month ago, I think that feels right, and are working through that. And then as we have capacity, can take on opening these other staffless programs. The one program that's a little exceptional, I just want to make sure people understand, is the CREP, the Community Renewable Energy Grant Program. Compared to our other programs, the tail on that one is different because it's multi-year grants and projects that take a really long time to complete. So we really do need that staff to make sure that we're good stewards of our taxpayer dollars. So just to answer that comment back with just a comment that these programs do have tail, and having staff that can be flexible and lean in where we need them to so that we can get these dollars that we do have out to Oregonians is really important. And we have another question from Kathleen. How can we find out when hazardous waste or nuclear waste is being transported over our roads?
I see Max Woods, who's the head of nuclear safety and energy security, on the call, and I bet he would love to answer that question.
Yeah, thanks, Janine. Hi, everybody. The answer is every day. There is hazardous nuclear material on our roads every day. Most of the material that's transported on our roads today that's of nuclear radioactive is related to medical. That's by far the #1 category of material, medical and health related. But there's all sorts of material that moves around the state. And it's done, I'd like to think, in a really safe manner. We work closely with the shippers on the radioactive side. Of course, ODOE, local emergency responders are ready. We have a training program that helps emergency responders get ready for potential accidents to do what we can to make sure that the shipments are done safely.
Thanks, Max. Do you want to say anything about nuclear waste coming from Hanford? What we might expect in the next few years?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. Thanks, Janine. And we can share this statement that we put out last week that's on our website right now as well. The Hanford site, which is in Southeast Washington, about 30 miles north of Umatilla, is planning to ship for disposal significant quantities of waste material, radioactive and chemically hazardous waste from the Hanford site to disposal locations in Utah and Texas. Large quantities of the waste, we're talking millions of gallons, tens of millions of gallons of waste, and it would take a decade or so of shipments to finish this process. What we are advocating for and fighting for Oregon is that the waste be treated and turned into a solid material in grout format, which kind of like a cement block, before it comes into Oregon, and that liquid radioactive waste not be shipped through our state. And so we're really trying to fight the best we can to do that and to protect Oregonians and our environment. Working closely with Washington State, with the U.S. Department of Energy, with our congressional delegation and local interested parties as well to try to make that happen.
Thanks, Max.
Yeah.
So I've put a few additional resources on the slide, and these are links if you pull up the slide deck that Jenny put in the chat. But if you read through all these, you'll know what I know about the budget. And I will just close by saying that we just really appreciate you showing up and your interest in ODOE's budget, and would be happy to provide any additional information if there's something that you're interested in that we didn't cover today. If you look through all the slides and you have a question about something that you read, we are always happy to talk about our budget. So please don't hesitate to reach out by phone or email to me or Christy or anyone else on the list. And we also welcome your continued engagement as this budget moves forward through governor's recommended budget and then through the legislature. So I will continue to pause in case people have additional questions. But that is the end of our presentation. So if you don't have additional questions, feel free to enjoy your sunny Wednesday afternoon.
You did get another one. Do you expect the governor to recommend policies in the energy space beyond what we've recommended?
It's a great question. There are some legislative proposals. We've got some placeholder bills that are there in case there are recommendations from the reports we've been doing that are directed by that executive order 25-29. And so she may take a look at some of those reports and recommendations and turn them into legislative proposals. But I don't know of any particular policies in the energy space beyond what's in our budget right now, unless it has to do with, DEQ or PUC's budget. Christy, is there anything that you'd want to mention there?
Nope, I think that's fair. I think Jennifer's likely aware, but for the folks on the call, there are a few work groups. They are not led by the governor's office, so this is a bit of an aside. But usually if there's a legislative work group, you kind of know some legislation's coming. So just and these are not secret in any way, but just in case people haven't heard, there's one happening on transmission and existing rights of way. There's one on energy facility siting and land use specifically, the nexus between the two. And then there's also one on cooling needs to help protect people from extreme heat events. Those are the 3 work groups that we're participating in as an agency, and expect legislation to come, not necessarily from the governor, but those are usually just ones you kind of know to expect when there's work groups.
Thanks. Happy to hang out here if people have additional questions. Give us some awkward silence before we close down the meeting. Hey, Christy, what do you think?
I think we left follow-up information, so if people have questions, they can write us, and we can let people go and get on with the rest of their days.
All right. Well, thanks again for joining. Thanks, ODOE team, for being here. Appreciate it.